digital privacy or security to a room full of relatively non-technical people. Also, almost everyone, because you're smart. How many of you have been asked to do a security training? Also, nearly all of you. How many of you actually did it? Like a reasonable number. Excellent. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to do a good security training, since obviously the people in this room are the people who frequently get asked to do them and things that look like them. So why am I doing this? Because when I started training, I had no idea what I was doing. It was 2011 or 2012, it's all kind of lost to the mists of time, but a university asked me to speak to their journalism students about digital privacy and security for a couple of hours. So I put together a slideshow of the things that I thought might be useful. I went, here are a bunch of scary stories about journalists with bad OPSEC. Here are some tools you might find useful, like PGP or Tor. And looking back at that slideshow, I think that there is room for improvement. And so I wanted to build the talk around what I wish 2011-2012 EVA had known. So one of the most important things that I wish that I could tell myself when I was starting out training is this. You don't have to do it alone. I wish that when I put together my first training that I had sat in on someone else's workshop or co-facilitated a class with somebody who actually had, I don't know, any experience. I had a lot of ideas about what my audience, in this case journalism students, might do in order to protect themselves and their sources, but it seriously never occurred to me to run them by a single journalist and find out if the stuff that I was recommending made sense to them or was compatible with their workflow. So it is no longer 2011 or 2012, and the landscape has changed a little, and now there are resources with walkthroughs and discussions of key concepts and talk about best practices, which you can find online. And some of those resources include surveillance self-defense, security in a box, Level Up, and tinfoil.press, I think, which also goes by the name of Tinfoil 2.0. If you're just getting started now, the next key piece of advice is use the resources, but also take the time to talk to more experienced trainers as well as people from the populations that you're trying to address. The next thing that I wish that somebody had told me when I was starting out is this. Technical people make some of the worst digital security and privacy trainers I have ever seen. I am not kidding. We are the worst. And I am also talking about my own early work. This comes from a place of deep, deep love. And also having made many personal mistakes. And why are we the worst? Why are we so very bad at this? Dunning-Kruger, which is the complex in which we don't even know what we don't know. And so we are extremely confident about this thing that we don't know anything about. And just go rushing in with almost no experience, which is fairly close to what I did back in the day. Again, it never occurred to me to talk to a single journalist before I went and trained journalists. This is a problem. This is severe, crippling levels of Dunning-Kruger. You may notice that the next part of competence comes a giant valley of low confidence. And that is where I am coming to you from right now. That bit where you suddenly realize that you know nothing. You're basically Jon Snow. So, the biggest problem with technical people teaching to non-technical people about these concepts is that we all think we know how to teach. So we've all spent a lot of time in school, and we've all had teachers, which leaves us with the impression that we know how this is done. The teacher is the person who stands at the front of the room and explains things, right? Bueller? Anyone? We think we're good teachers because we love explaining things. This is not the case. It turns out we love explaining things in order to demonstrate our mastery of the subject. We usually don't care much about whether or not the person we're informing, often against their will, actually understands the thing that we're explaining. Part of you may not even want to know whether or not the people you are training have learned the key concepts from your training. if you're like me, once you start making the effort to find out with like follow-ups or questionnaires, the answer may turn out to be a depressing no. So best to just close our eyes and not find out whether or not what we're doing is working. So it's tempting to just show up, demonstrate that you're very smart, throw on your cape, and then leave. But that's not being a very good teacher. Teaching, particularly teaching adults, turns out to be a skill. And it's a skill you may not already have. So I recommend that the people who are out there sort of getting started in trainings take the time to learn a little bit about the fundamentals of adult learning before you give a training. Lots of people have thought about this. This includes understanding their motivations and barriers to adult learning. I started off believing that the way to teach people about privacy and security was through hours of lecturing. Because again, I get to stand up in front of an audience and demonstrate that I'm very smart, which is teaching, right? But the more that I teach, the less I talk. I try to incorporate activities that involve the students asking questions, drawing diagrams, installing software, or talking to each other, because then I can listen to what they say to each other and I have a better idea of whether or not they have actually learned the key concepts, which is our goal here, rather than just getting up in front of a room and demonstrating that we are very smart. So there are some other things that we should consider when we are doing trainings. One of them is creating a space for asking questions. One of the interesting power dynamics in a room where you're giving privacy and security trainings is that you are the expert, and everybody else in the room may feel embarrassed or ashamed to bring up their issues, or to admit that they don't know something, or to admit to a bad practice. And so really setting the expectations such that anyone feels that they can come out and say stuff and their peers will not shame or make fun of them, and you will not shame or make fun of them, is really important. I cannot count the number of times that I have heard other people say in a training, that's just stupid. Why would anyone do that? Or if you do that, you don't deserve privacy or security. And these are not useful things to say in a training, as it turns out. Dealing with that one person who wants to dominate the conversation, almost everybody who has done a training knows that there's always that one guy who won't shut up, who wants to talk to you in order to demonstrate that he is also very smart. So knowing how to sort of recruit that person and turn them into a helper rather than somebody who just sucks all the air out of the room and keeps everybody else from learning is a very important skill. And finally, be aware of the power dynamics in the room. Generally, if you are a cis white dude, you have a lot of default power as the expert in privacy and security, and people will defer to you, even when you have no idea what you're doing. I once had a training, actually a couple of months ago, in which I had one of the students asked me a question about mobile malware. And the guy who flew me out to do the training, the person who hired me, interrupted me and explained to the student that this is a very complicated question that involves really specialized experts who can explain mobile malware to you. And I turned to him and I said, I'm an expert. I have written many papers about this. I am not just an expert, I am the expert that you have specifically hired to come 3,000 miles in order to meet these people and talk to them about their problems. But for some strange reason, this guy who was completely not qualified to answer the question still felt the need to walk all over me. So be aware of the dynamics, and that the cis white dudes basically have the most power, and from there on in, it just kind of goes downhill. Principles. I think you should have some when you're training. The first is, first do no harm. This may seem extra super obvious. It is stolen wholesale from the Hippocratic Oath. If you are going to say don't grab other people's devices, but if somebody hands you a device, don't accidentally erase it. Don't give them bad advice that's going to expose them, and it otherwise potentially cause them harm. Sometimes I train people in extremely vulnerable populations, and it's really important for no one to know who I am training, because the fact that they are learning about how to protect themselves online is in itself potentially very harmful to them. So that's something to keep in mind. The next is meet people where they are, not where you think they should be. This really comes down to the if you do blank, you don't deserve security or privacy. Try telling activists that they shouldn't use Facebook. What are you going to do when they then do all of their activism on Facebook? It is not useful to tell them, well, you just shouldn't do this, because then you have not been in line with principle 3, which is give people advice they're actually likely to follow. If I walk into a room of Windows users and tell them that the best way to be secure is to switch over to Linux, how many of them do you think are actually going to switch over to Linux? 1, 2, 0, definitely 0. I'm going with 0. In which case, I have demonstrated that I am very smart, but I have not actually helped the people in the room. So have some principles. Enjoy. Some things that don't work. Scaring your audience. You may remember from my description of my very first training that I started out with a bunch of scary stories about bad things that had happened to journalists and their sources as a result of bad OPSEC. It turns out this is not very empowering. All you've done is you've scared your audience's pants off and you haven't given them a thing that they can do in order to fix things. Scaring your audience leads to security and privacy nihilism, which is the belief that your adversary knows everything all the time anyway, and so why should you bother protecting yourself at all? Which is definitely a violation of first do no harm. So don't do that. Another thing that doesn't work is the insecurity demo. I will not make anybody here admit it, but I have talked to many trainers who have had the brilliant idea of saying, I am going to demonstrate to the people that I'm teaching how dangerous their security practices are by waiting until they walk out of the room and then hacking all their stuff and then showing them all the stuff that I have on them when they come back into the room. What? Don't do this. To begin with, you have violated first do no harm like you wouldn't believe. Also, it doesn't work. Again, everybody becomes very scared, nobody feels empowered, and all you've done is really violated the trust that you had with the people in the room, that you would not hurt them, that you would not humiliate them, that you would not bully them. And then they cannot learn from you. So this is a terrible mistake that often, if you're a technical person, sounds like it would be such a good idea. Next, do not touch or crowd your participants. Just be aware that everybody has sort of different ideas about what is appropriate physical contact, and always err on the side of distance. Do not lean over the people that you are teaching and take over their keyboard. Do not grab their phone from them. Which leads me to the very last thing, which is know your audience. Do not make inappropriate jokes. If, for example, you are a man giving a training in, say, the Middle East, now is not the time to make jokes about safe sex. This is not going to work. People are not going to trust you. You're going to get a whole lot of side-eye, and you're going to do some harm. Also, you're being a creep. So this leads us to the very important question, which is that now that I've told you a whole bunch of stuff that you shouldn't do, where do you go from here? Things are potentially now very scary. I have possibly broken my own rule in that I may have scared the pants off of all of the people who are already doing trainings, and they're all worried that I'm going to get mad at them if I find out that they're doing one of these things, and that I will humiliate them in large groups. It turns out none of this is true. You have the power. And the most important aspect of this is that you have the power to screw up less than I did. My recommendation, if you are doing a training, is to start small. Start with a population whose needs you understand and that you know, or that is similar to you. Learn from other trainers, and use existing resources. And finally, do not scare, shame, or bully anyone. And if you can follow these guidelines and the principles that I went over, then everybody can do better trainings and you can all screw up less than I did. Thank you.